The first thing one sees when looking at a rack of clothing are the sleeves. We are going to see how one mounts a sleeve into an armhole, correcting the armhole and making the sleeve fit the way it was meant to fit. By that, there is an unmounted sleeve, that is a sleeve without any seam, a blouse sleeve, a puffed sleeve with gathers, a shirt sleeve, and the sleeve we're going to deal with, the dress sleeve. The first thing one must do in setting a sleeve into an armhole is making sure that your armhole is correct. And with your garment on the dress form, let's check the armhole. Remember, very often when you have draped a pattern, you're going to find that translating it to fabric may change the fit of the garment. So we must look at the dress on the dress form and check out, does that armhole fit the way the original pattern intended it to fit? Well, we can look at this, and right now we see that there is some change. The ridge is here, but the armhole seam seems to fall in this area. So what we're going to do first thing is correct the armhole before we attempt to put a sleeve into it. And we correct by placing pins following the curve of the armhole based on the dress form. Pins, or if the fabric allows, chalk. Now, as this fabric is a very light color, I may be able to see the chalk, but I do believe pins will be a little more visible. And you correct it. We are going to correct only one side of the garment because it's easier to balance out by bringing both, matching one side to the other side as opposed to fitting it independently. With my pins in place, I can see that there was a large change. We'll take the garment off the dress form and we'll correct the armhole. We correct, first of all, by basting a new seam line. Thread trace following your pins. If your pins are placed smoothly, you should be able to do it with just visibly following your pins. The necessity of bringing the thread trace marking to the right side is evident because we are going to set the sleeve into the armhole on the dress form. One never puts a sleeve into a garment without placing it on the dress form first. Once the armhole has been perfected on one side, we're ready to set up the garment for the other half. It's important to remove the thread tracing at this point that duplicates the original armhole. We remove our pins, and now we must duplicate the corrected armhole to the other side of the garment. And we do that by placing the corrected side over the other half with right sides together and placing pins at matching points. Shoulder, the notches, the underarm seam, and when your armhole is sort of one inside the other, we will use carbon paper or tracing paper, always white tracing paper, to copy over the correction on the other half. Your tracing wheel, and when it's quite visible, unpin and thread trace once more, so we will have the corrected line on both sides of the dress form. With the garment back on the dress form and the armholes corrected, we're now ready to start setting our sleeves into the armhole. Of course, we've eased the cap of the sleeve. The sleeve has been stitched, and very often we can finish the bottom edge of the sleeve so that you will not have to handle a garment, a completed garment, in finishing the sleeve. We now will take both threads that have been stitched on the cap of the sleeve and pull it up at the very center. You pull up enough to curve or shape your cap. At this point, we're really not too sure how much we must shape it, but we make an attempt to shrink some of the fullness out before we try to set it into the armhole. Keep pulling the E-stitch gently. The point is we're going to shrink. This is a smooth sleeve, smooth cap sleeve, so we do not want to gather the cap. If we were making a puffed sleeve, we would gather the top of the sleeve. But this calls for a smooth cap. Once the sleeve is drawn up, so when the sleeve is laying on the table, center to center, you should have a very gently rolled cap. Accommodate the top of the shoulder. We're now ready to set it in the armhole and to measure out the fullness. We start by pinning seam, underarm seam to underarm seam. And we'll pin the inside of the sleeve to the seam line, matching notches. matching your thread trace line. Now we check to see, will that sleeve fit the armhole? By tucking under along the last row of stitching, which is actually your seam line, you match up the top of the sleeve and you check it out. Well, that looks as if it will fit fine. So we now remove this sleeve and repeat the process on the second sleeve. So both sleeves are drawn up the same amount. You can place one sleeve in the other, or you can measure with a tape measure, but both sleeves must match. We will now go to the iron to steam out the excess fullness. With the E-stitched pulled up the desired amount to shape the cap of your sleeve, we are going to shrink it on the sleeve hem. The sleeve hem is the form of the top of a sleeve. It helps in many other areas in pressing, but we use it at the moment for pressing the cap of the sleeve. Make sure that your sleeve is inside out or the wrong side up. Place the area to be shrunk to the top of the hem, and with a small amount of steam, press until you have controlled your ease. Some fabrics will shrink easier than others. You must shift your sleeve so that each area gets the right amount of pressing and will be shaped correctly. A wool or linen will shrink very, very easily. Once you have steamed out the ease, you return the sleeve to the right side and gently crease along the stitching line to make sure that you have removed all the puckers. When you have seen you've removed all the puckers, you may set it into the armhole. If not, you have to go back to the hem, replace the sleeve on the hem, and continue to steam. We'll now move back to the dress form to pin our sleeve into the armhole. With our sleeve steamed, the excess fullness removed, we'll return the sleeve to the dress form and pin the sleeve back into the armhole. Match up the center or the top of the sleeve with a pin and slip pin the remaining armhole and sleeve together, because we've got to remove this and baste it. The whole purpose of this sleeve is to fit smoothly. An option at this point is to either baste the sleeve into the armhole on the dress form, or to remove the garment from the dress form. and baste it in place. We will remove this from the dress form and baste the sleeve. We'll baste following the sleeve seam as opposed to the armhole. And once the sleeve has been basted in, it's advisable to try it on once more. It's at this point that if you are using a live model, it's important to get the sleeve for a live fitting. Very often, a person may be uneven or not matching from one side to another, so a correction may have to be made. As your pins are often on the right side, you just have to smooth out the seam line as you're basting, and we will remove the pins as you go along, or once you've completed your basting, you remove the pins from the right side. You see how I am following my thread trace line? That's where the sleeve has been pinned to. Care should be taken that you follow all your seam lines. And make sure you don't make a mistake and retrace your lines and end up by using your original lines as opposed to the corrected seam. We finished our basting, and we'll replace her, or the dress, on the dress form. Remove all your pins before you do that. Of course, it's advisable to do both sleeves before you have your fitting, but under the circumstances, we will just do this one sleeve. And there we are. Check to see that you have absolutely no puckers. Make sure that the cap fits smoothly, that the sleeve hangs in the prescribed manner for the style of the sleeve. We're now ready to go to the sewing machine to stitch the sleeve into the armhole. With the sleeves basted into the armhole, remove all thread tracings and notch thread tracings. You do not want to catch this excess thread as you sew on the sewing machine. The sleeve basted. We'll now stitch our sleeves into the armhole. Place the garment under the sewing machine with the bodice down and the sleeve up. You're now going to sew in this position. Hold the thread away from the needle so it will not tangle underneath, and take a few stitches to adjust yourself. Stitch on the outside of the basting stitch. and start stitching following your basting line. Care should be taken that you do not catch the bodice as you're sewing your sleeve in, because the sleeve having one shape and the armhole another shape, very often the excess material will fall under the press-a-foot and you will stitch a fold. Be very, very careful as you're stitching along your eased cap that you do not form puckers. Also, care should be taken that your seam allowances that have been pressed open remain open and do not fold over. A sleeve cannot be stitched in too quickly. Many things have to be watched as you stitch. When you come to your start, overlap your stitches about ½ inch. Remove the garment from the sewing machine and remove the basting. Once more, break your basting stitch every few inches and then remove it. Do not try to remove all the basting with one pull of the thread. We will now deal with the seam allowance. Of course, even before we attempt to do anything with the seam allowance, we must check our sleeve that it has been stitched in correctly without any puckers visible on the outside. Well, these puckers will be taken care of when we return to the iron. So now, let's see what we do. In order for a sleeve to fit comfortably, we have to reduce the amount of seam allowance. We need more seam allowance. We need less seam allowance around the armhole. So one way to do it is to trim away. Before we trim away, we'll stitch a second row of stitching to secure the sleeve so the sleeve will not, the threads will not pop, and we'll have a nice finish to our seam allowance. We return the sleeve to the sewing machine and stitch using 1/4 inch seam allowance from the original seam line. So if you place your press-a-foot against the first row of stitching, you will have the desired amount of seam allowance. Again, we stitch with the sleeve up as opposed to the armhole up. You have more control over what's happening in the sleeve area in this manner. When finished, you do not have to remove the ease stitch from the cap of the sleeve. We overlap our stitches ½ inch, remove the garment from the sewing machine, and trim away our threads. We now have 2 rows of stitches around the armhole. And we now trim, and we will trim this so the seam allowance is reduced to almost 1/4 inch. That will permit the arm to have plenty of room and the sleeve not to bind. There are several other finishes that can be put around an armhole. For instance, if you're making a sleeve in a sheer fabric, you may finish the seam allowance with a little bit of bias tape. If you're finishing a sleeve for a sportswear type garment, you may finish your sleeve with an overedge stitch. Here we have some thread that must be trimmed away. And if you're finishing the sleeve for a couture garment, an overcast stitch is often placed around the raw edge of the sleeve just to give it a little finer touch. And the overcast stitch is kept just to that second row of stitching. Otherwise, for all essential sewing, the sleeve is finished when the seam allowance is trimmed. We will now move to the iron to press our sleeve in the armhole. We have stitched our sleeve and finished the seam allowance. The final step on a sleeve is to press it so any remaining puckers disappear, and it's very important that a sleeve be correctly pressed into an armhole. And we do it by bringing both edges together and laying the garment on the ironing board with the sleeve up. As you see, we have the sleeve on the inside. And we press both seams together, making sure that the iron will just extend approximately 1/4 of an inch into the seam line, so you will not crease your sleeve any more than necessary. Care should be taken that you do not press the shoulder or the armhole area too deeply with the iron, otherwise you will form creases. Just pressing the two edges together entirely around the armhole. When that's complete, your sleeve is ready, and you're ready to continue with your garment.